Thank you. The great tension of social life, we being like our kin, the ants and the bees, enormously social creatures. And the great tension is how the hive or the colony lives and moves and makes decisions, and how individuals live and move and make decisions. In the case of the eusocial insects like ants and bees, it's really very robotic. They don't have a lot of decision-making power. The collective decision is made by the way they all interact together. In human society, it's so much richer and so much more complex that there can be a rather big difference between what the society is trying to do, where it's going, and it seems to have a capacity to go and do things, like invade Vietnam in this particular case, or for the Japanese to invade China, or you name it. So the society seems to have a way of going, of making decisions, of doing things that individuals in the society say, no, that's a mistake. We don't want to do that. And how to bring those two together is something we still haven't quite figured out. And certainly the Vietnam War was really one of the great examples of that. I really will be talking about both those aspects of how the society seems to have a mind of its own and a will of its own to do things that may be contradictory to a whole lot of people in the society. And at the same time, individuals can still have a life. Individuals can still have some freedom to actually act in a blessed way, to act in a way that's really lovely, beautiful, in the midst of the society that is trying to act in a very terrible way. And we saw that certainly with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Eddie Hillesum. So today I wanted to talk about a rather different perspective because, first of all, it involves us as a country. And it involves us a little bit in the position of the way the Nazis were involved with Eddie Hillesum and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It was the US that was invading this country thousands and thousands of miles away, this little country. And so it's interesting to look at this if you're the power, as opposed to the one who's being oppressed. If you're the oppressor, it's good to get a picture of that. And even if you're not the oppressor because you didn't want to go along with that, I can't say that because at the time I was about Thuy's age. I was in my 20s. And I thought it was a bad idea, but then I was a very great fan of Richard Feynman. And Richard Feynman's attitude about the Vietnam War is, they're both doing lousy things. They're both wrong. How can you support one or the other? They're both wrong. And he never did take an active position on the Vietnam War. But there are others who did, and I was not one of them. The other thing that I think is interesting about today is that Barack Obama is in Vietnam today. The first United States president to go there since those hostilities. And I think that's a good thing. I'm sort of glad that it happened and the two came together. So as we go through this life, keep an eye out for how this big thing, the hive, the society, has this life of its own, that it's going to do things, and how individuals themselves can still try to be living a blessed life. So I thought first of all, it's useful just to get oriented, because here's the map of the world. Here's the US of A. Where's Vietnam? Well, you can go west, go around and come out here, or you can go east. But Vietnam, well, here's China, Russia, here's the Mediterranean, here's Europe, Africa, North Africa, Middle East, and here we are in Pakistan, Nepal, and Laos, Thailand, and little Vietnam is this strip of ocean bordering country right here, with Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos to the land side. It is thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States. And yet, somehow, it was thought the United States had to go there, had to send men and munitions and a major war effort at this little tiny country. It's true also that the French had a colonial regime that they established at the end of the 19th century there. And it's interesting that the Vietnamese seem to be able to, first of all, the Vietnamese were very powerfully under the influence of China. And so their culture had a lot of Chinese influence. And China, in turn, had some influence from Vietnamese art and religious practices. So there was some mixing there. This is a photograph from Hanoi, Vietnam, from the 1950s. You can see it's a very civilized city. It had a lot of influence of French culture. And this is the city in which Thuy Tram was born. She was born to an educated family. Her mother and father were both physicians. Her father was a surgeon, and she herself studied medicine. So this is not Afghanistan. This is a very fairly sophisticated culture. She came from a family of 3 sisters and a brother. She was the eldest child, and she was a medical student in the 1960s and was going to specialize in surgery, and did specialize in surgery. When she finished the first course in surgery, it was her intention to become an eye surgeon. That was her plan. But of course, the war came along, and she volunteered to become a medical doctor treating wounded soldiers. So here is Hanoi up here. Here's this strip of land that's very strongly bordered by the ocean. There's a lot of fishing in Vietnamese culture. And there's this famous trail you might have heard of that connects the country, that's sort of in the lee of a mountain range, called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that was the trail that basically all of the supplies and communication with the north was fed into the south. I won't go into the details of the war itself and its origins, but basically the regime in the south still had enormous residue of elite and privileged landowners, and the revolution in the north had already removed a lot of that elite and powerful landlord culture. so that the peasants, it was a peasants' revolution in many ways. But this had not completely happened yet in the South. And it was the South that the US was going to try to hold together. And in fact, they hoped that they could roll back the communist revolution all the way back. And of course, they didn't. So Thuy is volunteering, and she makes this long journey down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a couple hundred miles, and ends up in this central province of Quang Ngai. Quang Ngai is a very great stronghold of resistance to this regime in Saigon. And therefore, it's a kind of focus of the American and South Vietnamese attack. It's a beautiful region where the mountains that border and which the Ho Chi Minh Trail kind of follows, with lots of moisture, great farming land after you flow down from the mountains. A really beautiful and lovely place.
And she volunteered for the North?
Yeah, she's a North Vietnamese. She's North Vietnamese. She is the enemy. She is the enemy. So what I thought I'd do is read what we know about her. I should tell you how we come to know about her. She kept a diary from the time that she went south and wrote in it just about every day. And in that diary, we learn about her, we learn about her life, we learn about exactly what's going on around her. And the diary was saved by an American intelligence officer. Thuy was ambushed and shot in the forehead and killed when she was coming down a trail when the American forces found her. And they collected her belongings, and what she had were vials of Novocaine, medical drawings that she had drawn of surgeries that she had done, and this diary was in her backpack. And the intelligence officer, when they would just collect the clothing and the possessions of people that they had killed and burn them. And so they were throwing all of this stuff into a trash barrel to burn. And his translator said, the intelligence officer's name was Fred Whitehurst. And the translator said, "Don't do that." He said, this already has fire in it. And it was saved. There's a nice story about Fred Whitehurst that I won't go into complete detail now. I might tell you more about it in the question and answer session. It was a major change in his life, changed his life quite completely. And he took the diary and he brought it back to the United States. And that's how we have it. He was also given, somebody found a second volume that she had written, and that was added to the volume that he had. So, Thuy's diary, yes?
She was murdered. She was just walking down the trail alone?
No, she was with two other soldiers.
She was with soldiers?
Yeah. She wasn't herself armed. She never carried weapons, but she was with two soldiers. And one of the other soldiers was killed at the same time, and the other one was managed to escape. So we'll get a flavor of the life of a human being and the life of the world going on around her. So her first entry that I'm going to read is from the 10th of April in 1968. She's just done one of her early surgeries. Now bear in mind, she's 26 years old, and she's doing major surgery, and she apparently is pretty good at it. She says, for a night and a day, I worried about Sang's operation. I was so happy to see him sit up this afternoon. His face bore deep lines of pain and fatigue, but a smile slowly bloomed on his fragile lips when he saw me. His hand cupped over mine, a touch filled with warmth and trust. Oh, you brave, wounded soldier, my love for you is as vast as it is deep. It's a physician's compassion for her patient. It's a sister's love for her sick brother. We're the same age, you and I. And in admiration, it is a love special beyond others. I'll say something more about expressions of love and affection of these young Vietnamese men and women. It's really fascinating and very moving how they navigate this territory. Did you see in my anxious glance? Did you feel the tenderness in my hand on your wound, on your pale, thin arms? Oh, I wish you a quick recovery, son, so you can return to your comrades and return to your lonely old mother who waits for you every hour, every minute. So this is a typical entry. So here, from the 4th of June of 1968, the more I face reality, the more complexity I discover. Why do humans have so many demands? The more one wants perfection, the more one has demands, and down that path one encounters ever more thorny obstacles. And yet if one does not persevere, one surely will fail. Oh, this girl who lives with so many thoughts, don't think too much. It only brings you a heavy burden of pain and sadness. Let's find joy. Let's live with forgiveness and sacrifice. Don't ask too much of life anymore. I remind you again, she's 26 years old. She's a very young person, and this is so typical of the idealism and reality that young people have to deal with. Rain is falling without respite. Rain deepens my sadness. Its chill making me yearn for the warmth of my family. If only I had wings to fly back to our beautiful house on Loduk Street to eat with Dad and Mom and my siblings. One simple meal with watercress and one night's sleep under my old cotton blanket. Last night, I dreamed that peace was established. I came back and saw everybody. Oh, the dream of peace and independence has burned in the hearts of 30 million Vietnamese for so long. For peace and independence, we have sacrificed so much. Thuy met early on a young man about her age who was a teacher. And she was very fond of him. He was obviously a very exceptional person, very interested in the natural world, very thoughtful, and the two hit it off really quite well together. His name was Kim. As with the weather in the north, another storm rages within my heart. Worries and longings. Oh, on the north, stay firm, be triumphant as in the victorious days. There are many obstacles. Young men have already left for the battlefront, and the women folk at home surely have a hard time. And where are you this afternoon, my dear ones? Dear brothers and sisters down in the plains. A friend rushing to the line of fire, a dear one resting within the bloom of our motherland. Oh, Kim, the evening has turned a faint shade of violet. There you might hear the murmur of lapping waves. There you might see the familiar road from Thuy Tram to New Hamlet. Do you remember those violet evenings? Why are you silent? You are already silent. You cannot answer me ever again. He had already been killed. This is an entry from the 17th of April, 69. I have another dear friend here in the South. So from now on, you're my big brother, aren't you, Tan? I'm a little lost when I think that although you're busy with 1,000 tasks as district secretary, you have time for me, a young sister from the North, whom you consider kin. You still reserve your thoughts, worries, and longings for me. It's exactly as Ni says in a letter I received today from the North. Ni was a previous young man she was very fond of. Quote, our revolution is magical because it opens our hearts and eyes to a beautiful world. There the fire of love is brightly lit, even though today's life is dangerous and painful. Now I sit by my younger brother. His ragged breathing and his feverish body under the thin blanket fill my heart with sorrow and love. I want to hold him, share his exhaustion. I want to hug him, hold him in my arms like a mother cuddling her sick child. That sentiment is honorable, but I cannot act on it because not everyone in this life can understand such honorable love. There are many scrutinizing eyes and detestable rumors. How sad. When can society rid itself of those outdated thoughts? When will people live entirely by affection, by a clear and pure soul? Oh, my young brother, understand my love. Feel it in the generous touch of my hand on your forehead. See it deep in my affectionate eyes. Recognize the love that I cannot express to you in words. Now, as best I can understand, and I took some pains to find a little bit about it, Vietnamese society of young people in their teens and 20s, where sexuality is at its height, were very, developed this really wonderful way of having older sisters and younger brothers. And you will hear that in their language, in their letters, where they refer to my older brother or my younger sister. And what they're trying to express is a relationship that is full of warmth and affection, but is not crossed the barrier into sexuality. And everyone who says anything about Thuy says that she never experienced sex, except the closest that she came were sharing kisses. And that seems to be the case. But you can tell these young men and women are enormously attracted to one another. They're in a state where they need companionship and affection. And they manage to live it out without it being completely sexual. They manage to hold the line on it and still can be intimate in their feelings. It's very remarkable. I thought it was quite lovely. So that's the little brother, big sister that you constantly see being in Vietnamese conversation of intimate friends. All right, now the US air war cranks up, and I was having a conversation with Anna on the way over, relating the US air war in Vietnam with the ISIS beheadings of today. I think some of you who may have been to some of my lectures heard about the morality of if you lay hands on somebody and hurt them, we have an intuitive morality that has a pretty strong barrier that you not do that. That's considered wrong. But if they get hurt without your hands being close by, even if you're kind of responsible, the intensity of resistance to doing that goes down. It's almost like gravity or something. The closer you get, the more powerful it is, and the farther away you get from it, the less powerful it is. Now, there are always a few people in the population who can overcome the resistance to cutting people's heads off. Just as there are, and I don't mean to say that surgeons are really quite capable of cutting people's heads off, but you have to have that kind of composition. You have to have that kind of personality or nervous system organization to be able to do it. And I can't do that kind of thing. I mean, I get sick. But I know that if you're a surgeon, you got to be able to do it. So I was thinking about the air war, the US air war, as basically getting your hands away from what you're doing. So you could drop a few thousand gallons of napalm and burn up several hundred people in a village while flying at 1,000 feet. You don't see that. You don't notice it. Your hands aren't anywhere near it. But if you were to actually have to take each one of these people, pour napalm on them and burn them before your very eyes, you couldn't do it. So there's a way in which, yes, the viciousness of some of these fundamentalist militia groups is quite nasty. But in a certain sense, it's no less nasty than the air war in Vietnam. It's just that you got your hands, you can keep your hands off of it. So it would be nice if we could develop as a society, the ability to see these kinds of connections. Because right now, ISIS is completely bad, horrible, wrong, and these are pretty bad guys, no doubt. But equally bad, horrible, wrong was the United States air war in Vietnam. There were two kinds of things that were used: gunships and helicopters. And this is the typical gunship. It's driven by propellers, and it's designed basically to attack a village, circle around it, and kill everything in it with machine gun fire, rockets, and bombs. And it carries all of those things. And you see it here. Here's somebody that's the crew member who's firing the high caliber machine gun. And I have to say, it was a perverse failure. It didn't work. So much suffering, so much misery, so much terrible immorality, and it was a failure. The US, as you know, could not force these people to its will. The US lost the Vietnam War, had to flee Saigon. So it was a failure. But this whole thing was, in a way, a big mistake. But it's very hard for a society to figure out when it's making a mistake, even if some people can see it and others can't. So that's what's going on now, and I want to read some entries from Thuy's diary during the air war. See, here we have 27 April 1969. Perhaps nothing is sadder than the evacuation scene. The houses abandoned, gutted of furniture, devoid of life. This afternoon, as I return to the clinic from the forest, the enemy is not far away. I look at the lovely houses and my heart fills with hatred. These houses bear so much of our efforts. So much sweat was poured into them, each straw, stalk, and stone. If we must leave this place, when can we have such treatment facilities again? I am not pessimistic, but I feel a strange sadness laced with anxieties. And I should mention that the mythology by which countries do this kind of stuff is that there are civilians. And the civilians are good people, and they are being oppressed by bad people who are the army. And what we are trying to do is destroy the army so that the civilians can live a good life. That's the mythology. That was the mythology of the Vietnam War. And what you see is these soldiers are the civilians. The whole society is under attack. They're all, there's no distinction between soldiers and civilians. They're all trying to survive, desperately trying to survive. Here's another entry about peace again. Last night, a dream of peace came to me in that chaotic, empty house. I dreamed of Hanoi and the large, cool rooms with their beige walls at Chu Van An High School. I dreamed of a music book with its pages, a lock of young Tran Tra's silky golden hair, and Hao's chrysanthemum. And I saw Dad, Mom, Uncle Heen, Brother Biao, and all my dear ones to the north. Oh, the dream is not mine alone, but it's a dream of peace and independence burning in the hearts of 30 million Vietnamese and in millions of people around the world. So along with the air war came defoliation. And this is a helicopter spraying Agent Orange. This is what happens afterwards. And this is actually on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mean, they bombed and Agent Oranged the Ho Chi Minh Trail continuously. So on 12 November 1969, Thuy writes, after 3 arduous months of wandering and struggling against the enemy, I returned to the forest. My heart aches when I look back to the lowlands. No birds can be heard. The hamlets and villages that have been sheltering me are now under the enemy's stampede. They have leveled the land from Duc Phong to Portal Mountain, standing at the tip of Hoi An, and one can see clear through to the beaches of My An, can see clear across all the land, all the way to the ocean. Our agony. The survivors are wandering through the devastation, homeless. They cannot leave their homeland, which has been rendered barren by the enemy's bulldozers. They cannot leave, for their hearts are bonded to the revolution and to their husbands and sons who are fighting this war. Each evening, wives steadfastly return to the turmoil to make meals for their husbands. And old mothers return from their hiding places by the river, their clothes thoroughly soaked to feed their children. So the period of June in 1970 was a particularly very difficult period for Thuy and her comrades. It's a common accident in war. A series of bombs falls exactly on my clinic, killing 5 people in the patient's ward at once. Everything, all that we've worked for, is consumed by fire and smoke. After the explosions, there is silence, a terrible silence. I think everyone must be dead. A few minutes pass, and suddenly Sister Lan shouts, "Everyone in Mr. Chan's room is dead." We all run outside. What a devastation. The area has been blasted bare, a vast hole in the forest, trees knocked down in every direction, houses flattened or knocked askew, tattered clothes blown up into the tree branches. By the time we dig up Neen and Bui, dusk has fallen. In the house, Than, who had been in intestinal operation yesterday, suffers more serious wounds today. He's in agony. Tan looks at each of us and says in shallow gasps, "Live. Fight on. I'm dying." This morning is also a Sunday, fresh after a rain. The air is calm. If not for the sky-tearing roar of aircraft, this morning would be no different from my daydream. My place has just again suffered another bombardment. The afternoon before yesterday, 2 observation planes circled for a long time and then launched rockets. The explosions sent everyone running to the shelter. Hearing the bomb blasts above my head, I thought they were dropping bombs on the hillside in front of us. When the enemy left after 4 waves of bombardment, we were surprised to find that the bombs had struck not more than 20 meters from us. The entire area was denuded of trees. Plastic sheets covering the houses were shredded and scattered. Shrapnel had cut beams and columns. Dirt filled the shelter. Fortunately, no one was injured. We all concurred that the location had been exposed. We immediately began once again to find another place to build a new clinic. All the healthy people went out, leaving behind 5 seriously wounded and non-ambulatory soldiers to be cared for by 4 female staff. Yesterday it was pouring rain. We covered the floor with plastic sheets, but the water still came in and flooded the building. Everyone was thoroughly soaked. All day long we collected water dripping from the leaks and tossed it outside. The injured sat shivering, completely soaked. Looking at the scene, I laughed as my eyes brimmed with tears, and Sister Lon asked me, "Does anyone know about our situation?" Yesterday in the ravaged scene after the bombardment, people despaired. People departed, loaded with their belongings. Brother Dat gazed at me and asked again, half seriously, half joking, "Does anyone know about this situation?" If peace is won, consideration must certainly be given to people who went through this. On the 20th of June in 1970, Thuy put her last entry into the diary. "No, I am no longer a child. I have grown up. I have passed trials of peril. But somehow at this moment I yearn deeply for Mom's caring hand. Even the hand of a dear one, or that of an acquaintance would be enough. Come to me, squeeze my hand, know my loneliness, and give me love, the strength to prevail on the perilous road before me." Thuy was killed 2 days later. I thought I would like to now say something about the Americans, what was going on with them. I won't say as much, but we actually have a memoir from an American nurse who was in Vietnam at the same time, not quite in the same location, some many tens of miles away, different area of operations. Her name was Linda Van Deventer, and she was a nurse, volunteered, and went to Vietnam. And she asks the question why, and I'll explain to you now by reading from her memoir. Half asleep, I hold the receiver to my ear. Incoming wounded, get everyone down on the double. It's 3 a.m. and play coup. Overhead, a helicopter begins its descent with more wounded as doctors, nurses, and medics push gurneys to the landing pad. The roar of the rotor blades becomes deafening. As soon as the bird touches down, the medical personnel and flight crew work frantically to unload the damaged human cargo. The pilot is a 21-year-old kid named Shortstop because he's barely 5'6". He has an oversized baby face that is usually dominated by his cute, puffy red cheeks. These cheeks are now a pasty white as he yells from his seat, "Get those fuckers moving, we gotta get back there quick." There's blood down the left of Shortstop's flight suit. I notice it as I'm helping another nurse drag a litter from the chopper onto the gurney. "Come on, assholes, we don't have all day," Shortstop screams. I jump back on the chopper and grab his left shoulder. I have to yell to be heard above the engine. "You're hit." "No shit, Dick Tracy." "Let someone look at it." "Later, Van, it's a fucking mess out there right now. Get the fuck off my goddamn machine so I can go to work." Although he protests, I quickly wrap a pressure dressing around his arm to stop the bleeding. It only takes a few seconds. With all the wounded cleared out, I jump to the ground. Shortstop's chopper is lifting off even before my feet have touched the earth. It's the last time I will ever see him alive. The emergency room is filled with the moaning and screaming of boys and men who have been rudely confronted with their own mortality. Their mangled and twisted bodies contorted by more than physical pain. Mixed among their cries are the urgent professional voices of medical people. "Get another IV into this one, he's shocky." "Somebody please help me." "There are only multiple fragment wounds on the legs, he can wait." "I want my mother." "Type and cross this one for 15 units. Please don't let me die." As I finish one soldier's examination, a weak hand grabs my arm. "Hey, Van." I turn to find Benny Dickinson, a 20-year-old field medic from the 4th Division, lying on the gurney. Almost every man in his platoon has been killed or wounded tonight. Benny has a gaping hole in his left side, exposing half his chest. Another is in his belly, and a bloody stump where his left leg used to be. Around the stump is a tourniquet that he probably applied himself. He might make it, but he'd need to get to an operating room quickly. "I apologize for the unexpected visit," he says. "I wanted to see if you guys are really working as hard as you say you are." I'm speechless. I've partied with Benny, compared stories about our respective childhood. And more than once, I've considered saying yes to his half-joking requests for a date. I wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Van, could you please do me a big favor?" he asks. "Sure, Benny. You need some morphine?" "No, it's Petrocelli over there." He lifts his arm weakly and points to a brawny, dark-haired kid about 5 feet away. "I ran out of plasma before he got hit, and he's lost at least 3 or 4 units. Get an extra IV into him." He continues, "When you get Mitchell into the OR, tell the gas passer," I guess that's the anesthesiologist, "to be careful putting him under. The crazy fucker just finished eating 6 cans of beans and dicks before he got hit." I cut away what's left of Bernie's fatigues, see he has a long, deep wound down to the bone in his back of his good leg. I cover him with a clean sheet. I touch his cheek before moving on to another casualty. 5 minutes later, with the chopper still bringing in the wounded, I am called to scrub for surgery. On my way to the operating room, I walk past Phil Conklin pushing a dead body toward the morgue. I glance down and see Benny's face. I want to cry, to mourn, not only Benny, but the thousands of like him who have come through the hospital. But tonight, neither Phil Conklin, nor I, nor any of the other personnel will shed a tear. There isn't enough time to cry while so many others are needing us. Later that night, when I awake, my body is shaking under the sheets, and I am saturated in sweat. I stare at the ceiling and try to tell myself it's all over. In spite of my best efforts, a single word keeps screaming inside my head. Why? Why? I don't know if many of you knew Walt Kelly and Pogo cartoons, but Walt had a very nice take on what was going on with America in the Vietnam War. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And it appeared in many of his cartoons. And it really is quite accurate. And you don't have to restrict it to America. This isn't strictly about America. It happens to be the context he lived in, we live in, so that's our experience. But it's universal. So I thought I would try to shed some light, give a partial answer to Linda Van Deventer's question, why? This is a war. This is a war between two sides. It's in the New Guinea highlands. And the opposing forces are just about, you can just see where the line of division is, right through here. And they're trying to approach each other, throw spears at each other, and prevail. The sad truth is, war for much of our genetic history is reproductively successful. If you went out and took things away from other people and used violence to get them away and used them for yourself, you actually, in many ways, did better. This isn't always going to work. In other words, aggression is not always a successful strategy, but aggression has its successful aspects. So, why is war part of the human experience? Why is it embedded in the genome and in the culture? Well, it's because of that fact. And what I would like to suggest is that war is a genetic disease. That's a much more fruitful way of trying to look at it and understand it than as something about good guys against bad guys. Now, what's a genetic disease? A genetic disease is something that is a feature or a capacity that's in the genome that is what the biologists call adaptive. That means it actually is reproductively successful. If you have this trait, if you behave in this way, you will have more children carrying those genes that also induce them to behave in that way. So men raiding other tribes for women and then impregnating them with the genes that dispose them to want to take women for themselves from other men are successful. And you can see that the ones who were not going to try to resist them were going to die out. Now, that's not all there is to the equation of life. Life is more than just that. And the tribe that's really good at that may be totally unsuccessful at raising crops, sharing them, and having a complicated society like a modern civilized society. Genghis Khan was able to take his crew and roar across Central Asia, turning grass into horses and men, who then turned more grass into horses and men. But what was running this was a certain genetic program in these men that wanted to do that. And of course, when they encountered a city that they wanted to besiege, they killed all the men and took all the women. But Genghis Khan is not running things today. We have somebody running for president who's a little like Genghis Khan. But fortunately, these kinds of characters have not dominated, and if they can't even quite become Genghis Khan. It's not possible, I hope. So it's in the genome because of this melancholy fact that genetically it works. But there are other things in our genome, like resistance to malaria. Especially if you're from equatorial regions, you have some built-in resistance to malaria. The only problem is, if you don't have any malaria around, it actually is detrimental to you. It's called sickle cell anemia. So what worked in one situation may not work in another. So that it becomes maladaptive. It's no longer adaptive, it's maladaptive. What I'd like to suggest to you is that war is a genetic disease. It's a behavior that's encoded primarily in the male brain and emotional system, but in the female and juveniles that are dragged along with them. It's a good thing in this kind of situation for a woman to find a big warrior to be the woman of, because then she'll be able to have lots of his children. She wants to have children, not going to be able to have some guy take her away and kill her children and start all over again. So it's not as though women are not part of this thing. Women are part of it too, but it's primarily in the male brain and emotional system. It's not working now. It's maladaptive. It's like suddenly people are dying of sickle cell anemia, but they haven't quite figured out what's wrong. Or cystic fibrosis, or any number of other genetic diseases that had a beneficent origin, but as the environment and the context changed, these were no longer useful. So the sooner we figure this out, I think the better. But it's not something that an individual can figure out. It's something that the whole society has to figure out and share together and agree on. Yes, we got a genetic disease. And maybe we should try to make some plans about how we could deal with it. But I don't think most people are even at the point yet where they can understand that this is a disease. So instead of looking at war as good versus evil, George Bush, actually one of his speechwriters, said, Iran is the axis of evil. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the Iranian leader at the time, said, America is the great Satan. So you had Tweedledee and Tweedledummer both saying, you're the evil one. I'm good, you're evil. So this is just this is so deeply ingrained in human beings, and it's got to be somehow transformed. So good versus evil is not helpful in this transition of dealing with war as a genetic disease. What is helpful is the development of strategies that get countries and nations to avoid aggression and to seek cooperation. So trade, global trade, is basically a good thing because it gets countries to cooperate. Very, very important thing, I think. It can be abused and all of that, but you got to get countries working together as opposed to working against each other. And dream of peace. Dream of peace. We shouldn't neglect the kind of mystery of how things happen. They don't just happen by plotting and planning, much as it's important to make some kind of effort to deal with the genetic disease of war. So I think I'm going to stop there. And we can now have questions or discussion. Go ahead.
I'm wondering how close are we to identifying the genes which are behavioral?
Good question. Good question. Good question. So he's asking, how close are we to identifying the genes? So the first thing I want to do is tell you that it's not just genes in the genome. It's the way the genome and the genes that it has develop the nervous and system and mind that links up with the culture. It's not just the genes in the body, it's the culture that's important in humanity nowadays. Actually, it's always been important. So it's a combination of genes and culture. The culture has to plug into the genes. If the genes aren't there to plug into, The culture is not going to stick to it. Can't do it. I imagine somebody will identify some genes that are, well, we already know something about the development of aggression in males. And so I think people will do that, but that's not going to be a panacea. It's not like, oh, well, let's just go into the genome and change it. No, this is silly. It's a much more tangled bank. You know Darwin's expression of the tangled bank, side bank of a stream with all of these vines and insects and worms and, all of life tangled together in it. Well, this tangle between genes and culture is like that tangled bank. You don't just easily change it. Now, one of the things that can help is just bitter experience. I think the fact of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs held in check the nuclear weapon trajectory that everybody was on. And how people keep trying to figure out how they can do the maximum they can without going nuclear. How we can get as much as we can without doing that. So when you burn yourself, when a child burns itself on the stove, it sort of gets the idea, don't do that. But there's a whole society that has to learn how to, don't do that. Stop doing that. You're just hurting yourself. Yes?
And I'm pretty sure, I know I'm among friends here, so I can make a statement. One of the things that my husband and I have said on occasion is that we got Barack Obama as president because George W. Bush was so bad that we would probably not have had an African-American president for some longer period of time had not those 8 years of George W. Bush not been so awful. My fear at this point, this thought occurred to me this morning, that the reason we have Donald Trump is because we've had 8 years of Barack Obama, and that that he is now tapping into that, oh my God, there's a black man in the White House mindset. And that's very scary, frankly. But I'm just, when you were talking about culture and having to sort of, it has to have a place to,
it has to connect.
Purchase
Yes.
in that. And that's my concern at this point. So I just was wondering what your comment might be on that.
Well, first of all, one has to be a little careful about throwing genetics around and culture around. It's a tricky subject, but they are coupled. There's no doubt about it. I have kind of a metaphor of a moving tide. When the tide is coming in, like once when I was traveling up, I don't know, I must have been 60 miles northwest of Manhattan, and I saw the Hudson River flowing the wrong direction, but actually it responds to the tide. So I think of the tide, I think of this movement away from our warlike past as like a slowly moving tide. But then there are these waves that, are oscillating back and forth on it. You go forward and backward. At the same time, you're kind of slowly moving in one direction. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's not steady. And I think after the presidency of Barack Obama, we won't see so much of this kind of stuff like, I love my country, but I don't trust the government. And there are very few black people, well, maybe nowadays, if they're talking about their local police department. But the point is that everybody can make that claim. I love my country, or why don't you love my country? Except we're kind of talking about different countries. And everybody wants to co-opt the country as theirs. And when politicians constantly say, the American people believe this, or the American people don't want that. You can't speak like that, except politically, for political rhetoric. It's not very useful or very helpful. Things are slow. It's a slow process. And things go backwards as well as going forwards. So I think that's a good metaphor for trying to understand what's happening.
I'm interested about your statement on trade, because what I see is a world that is rapidly getting more and more haves and have-nots, and I don't mean national, I mean the whole world has got very few people with incredible amounts of money.
That's a fact about, I mean, that is part of the phenomenon, but
Income inequality.
it would be nice if the trade system could become less subject to exploitation by a few. But I believe trade is really important. That's my personal opinion. When people hunker down, close their borders, don't want to see outsiders, don't trust other people. I mean, this is a recipe for where we've been. This is where we come from. Europe spent 400 years with all of these countries fighting each other, borders closed, etc. And they finally got to a place where it was, this is a much better place to live. Now, the thing you have to contend with is the overpopulation problem. The population of the world is so overpopulated now, you have refugees flowing everywhere. People struggling against each other just to get daily bread. This is a very difficult problem. And then that leads to more closing, more saying, I've got mine, stay out of here. But that just drives the whole system downward. Is that?
I think that the same genetic systems, not the same genes,
Right.
seems to drive pursuit of wealth the same way it does the war, where you get,
Well, wait till it becomes maladaptive. I wonder if there isn't something already about the maladaptation. Everybody's unhappy. And yet, we like to talk about how there's so many poor people in America, there's so many, but when I look around and I look at the kind of cars people are driving around in, and going out to restaurants, and life is, compared to the kind of ways people had to struggle, say, 150 or 200 years ago, living out on the plains, farming. Why is everybody unhappy if all of those needs are being met? So it's possible that the more is psychologically sickening. It makes people sick psychologically. It's like touching the stove and burning your hand on it. You get sick. How long is it going to take for that kind of connection to develop, where people say, bigger and bigger and bigger is what I want, and sicker is what I get? I don't know. But that's just a kind of, I'll throw that thought out, is that it may not be all it's cracked up to be, just like Genghis Khan and his hordes didn't take over the world, because you can't have a society that lives on grass and horses and warriors. And that's all there is to it. Did you have?
The current evil is ISIS. Where, other than fighting ISIS, where does this set of ideas go? see cooperation with evil?
I think ISIS needs to be cooperated with, or some reasonable people have to be found within that community that can be worked with. The same mistakes were made with the Taliban 15 years ago, 20 years ago, which was they're all bad, wipe them out. One of the things that you find about fundamentalist regimes is that they arise where people's existential situation is precarious. You don't find people in Denmark trying to install a fundamentalist regime, because the living situation in Denmark or in any of the developed countries in Europe, it's not existentially insecure. But if you're in Kabul, or if you're in Tripoli in Libya, or in Iraq, the situation is existentially insecure. You don't know who you can rely on, you can't make a life. And so what it needs is what Thomas Hobbes called Leviathan. Have you ever heard of Leviathan? Maybe in college or something. Well, Hobbes's idea was that, I can't recall a whole phrase, he had a long string of quoting human beings in their natural state, where life is brutish and short, because there's nothing to regulate, it's every man for himself. So his idea was that the state takes over all of the authority, it has the guns or the swords or whatever, and it tries to regulate selfishness. That's the idea. And that has its pluses and weaknesses and so on. But this is a fundamental problem of social life, is how to regulate selfishness. At the same time that you encourage experimentation, investment, trying things out. Something I want to say that sort of escaping me at the moment. Yes, I was going to tell you about Fred Whitehurst, but first of all I want to say something about ISIS. ISIS is like the Calvinist revolution, like the Protestant revolution in Europe. I don't mean one for one. But the Calvinists were strict. Calvin, when he organized the institutes, said that if you're I forget, well, it would have been I guess a Swiss or French word for the head man, but if you're the pastor of the institute, Calvin was really sensitive to how you had to serve the people. You couldn't just start building up your own little fiefdom. Because where Protestant Europe had come from is all of these Catholic families that held all these positions, and they had their children as priests and were holding all of the wealth. And here were these Protestants, they weren't even Protestants, but here were a whole lot of people that said, we want to overthrow this. And so one of the things that is really quite important in these fundamentalist movements is fundamentalism. Not very much freedom. Strictness to the principles. So that's why the ISIS thing is somewhat similar to Calvin, and whoever the big man is, maybe somewhat similar to Calvin. And Calvin did order the execution of people. There were fights with some of the Catholics who didn't go quietly, and he agreed to their execution. He didn't do it personally, but the Calvinists Protestants and Catholics executed people because of their not adhering to the strictness of the code. And it's, not so much what's written, it's the feeling. It's the feeling that people are following the rules. And it can also lead to lots of troubles and infighting, and the whole thing can kind of unravel if people start not trusting each other. The great thing that the Protestant Revolution had going for it was Luther and the Bible. Luther said the authority is not going to be any human being. It's going to be God. And where you get God's authority is in this book. That's where it is. And so it took the Pope away. No Pope. The book. Read the book. And if you want to claim something that you're doing is righteous, you better find it in that book. Now, you know that this isn't so simple at all. But it's somehow had enough momentum in it, enough going for it, that people could accept that. People could accept that. So ISIS's fundamentalism, look at Iraq. It's got a completely corrupt government. Same thing in Afghanistan. It's everybody for himself. And I don't know if the transition could be made to modernity by somehow working with these corrupt governments. That's the whole notion, I think, of the modern approach, is if we work with them, we can slowly get them to come around and slowly weed out all the corruption. But even in supposedly non-corrupt governments, there's corruption. And it's just corruption exponentially multiplied in places like Libya and Iraq and so on. So one of the things the fundamentalism does is people can start feeling comfortable. They may not have very much freedom, but they know that they can count on a few things like going to the market and so on, just as long as they kowtow to that oppressive authority. And it is oppressive. And maybe there's a transition period to finally when the oppressiveness is thrown off after the society has developed some cohesion. But it's interesting to see that how, I don't know, what are we, 10 years out now from the end of the Afghan war and the situation in Libya, people can't see to stop grabbing things for yourself. They can't resist it, even though they see it's leading to disaster. It's like you're all in this car together and it's going off a cliff. And you can't do anything but drive it off the cliff. It's sad. It's really sad that these militias that are all fighting each other cannot see what they're doing as fighting for their own self-interest and have no regard for the well-being of the Commonwealth. And even in America today, this business about the government being bad and all, and if you don't have a sense of some kind of commonwealth, especially the judicial system, especially a fair justice system, if you just feel it's all corrupt, it's all no good, you don't have a society. Individual people have to, in some sense, love their government as well as their country. And that doesn't mean you don't resist it if it needs resisting and it needs changing. But often what this means is the government that would suit me and would suit my self-interest is not the government we have. For example, it may have a black man, and I would like to have a white man. So it's not my government. I want to have a government of the people. And of course, politicians constantly talk about the American people. Well, they're only talking for the most part about half of the people at most. And they should recognize the other half is really important. We should have politicians who are talking about how to cooperate, how to come together, not about how we're going to smash one another and get our rights. It's again this going off the cliff and doing everything to keep it going off the cliff. We should have people arising today who say, stop this nonsense. Stop the internet business about nastily replying to everybody that you don't like. The internet is an enormous revelation of what's going on in the human mind today about these, I don't know if you've seen them, probably you have, you can't, people post things and then people attack them with the most vitriolic and nasty attacks. This is not the kind of society that I want to be with Thuy. I want to dream about peace with her. I don't want to do that sort of thing. Then you'd be so much happier. You'd be so much happier. My son said something nice. He said, when people do the right thing, they're so much happier. As opposed to getting their self-interest fulfilled. But doing the right thing. Which means sometimes denying your self-interest. Giving up some of your self-interest. Well, should I give 3 minutes to Fred Whitehurst, or? Okay. Interesting story about Fred Whitehurst. He was a very young man, and obviously fairly bright. He was a college grad, right out of college into the Army intelligence. So he was an intelligence officer. And I told you the story of how his translator stopped him from burning Thuy's diary. He brought the diary back to the US, and he kept it kind of in a safe place. Incidentally, he was not supposed to have done that. His brother, who was also in Vietnam, also in the service, had married a Vietnamese woman and learned Vietnamese. He learned to both speak and write Vietnamese. So the two of them together began trying to translate the diary. And they were really quite taken with it. At that point, they had a connection with one of the Texas universities. I think it was Texas A&M. They had some kind of program about preserving documents and so forth. And so the diaries were taken there. And a literary translator, a man whose name I can't pronounce probably, but I'll try. Andrew Pham, P-H-A-M. Andrew X. Pham translated the diaries. And they were not until 2002 was that completed. And in 2002, I should say something more about Fred Whitehurst. After he completed his service, he went back to college, got a PhD degree in chemistry, I believe, and went to work for the FBI as a forensic expert. This was about the time of the first attack in New York City on the Twin Towers, the little attack. And he was involved in that investigation. And he was so upset with the incompetence of the FBI, as he saw it, that he started a campaign of whistleblowing. And he made a lot of people really angry. And he got in a big fight with the FBI. He eventually resigned from the FBI. How could he not? And I'm not quite sure what he's doing now. But he's a bit of an interesting character. So what he did in 2002, when the diaries were translated, he made a trip to Vietnam. he first of all knew somebody from his days in the service who was traveling back and forth to Vietnam, and he had them deliver a copy of the diaries to Thuy's mother. Her father was dead. It said he died of a stroke when he heard of her death. But the mom, I think, is still alive, possibly. And her sisters, I think, are still alive. Her brother was killed in the war. So Whitehurst developed a relationship with the family, and then the family came to America and they had a ceremony and a celebration at Texas Tech or wherever that university was, kind of honoring the diaries, and the rest is kind of history. They're kind of all over the place now. Most people have heard of them, and they're well known. But it was Whitehurst who was the little bit of stream that this could flow into and flow out and still have a life. And I think, there's something kind of magical about Barack Obama being in Vietnam today. Here in our presence is this woman alive a bit. I hope I've brought her to life a bit. She's not dead. She's not gone. She's still present. Isn't that a miracle? Isn't that lovely?
And that's where you get your hope from.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Thank you.